Surprise! It's me again. I was thinking about changing my clothes, but I didn't think you'd fall for that. If you weren't here before, I was apologising because I'm hosting and speaking this morning. And if you weren't here, my name is Mike. I'm a volunteer here at the Forge. Now, this morning, as I said earlier, we're thinking about rules. We're in the third part and concluding part of our series, Heaven, Who Goes There? Now, I just wanted to see by a kind of show of hands in the room, who would classify themselves as rule followers and who are the kind of natural rebels, the rule breakers? So, rule followers to start with. Who's a rule follower? Put up your hands. Good, you did that immediately. Fantastic, thank you. Very compliant, like to follow the rules, yeah. Who are the rebels? Who like to bend the rules, break the rules? There's a few sheepish hands going up. Steve Shears, I saw that. Yeah, there's a few rebels in the room. I like it. Yeah, absolutely. Well done. In fact, there's probably real rule breakers that didn't put their hands up because they don't want to follow instructions, I guess. So I'm kind of in between, if I'm honest. I would say probably naturally more of a rule follower. I do kind of like the comfort and boundaries that some rules offer. However, I do have a tendency that if I don't agree with something or something, I would just try and find a way around it and perhaps break a few rules where necessary. And I don't know about what your household was like, but our household, this became really evident during COVID of who were the rule followers and who were the rule breakers. You see, Claire, my wife, she is a stringent rule follower, has to be compliant, really likes to follow the rules. That was really especially so in COVID. She would be the one sitting there at 5 p.m. every day with the Boris press conferences. She'd have a clipboard. She'd be making a note of the new rules, and we would be implementing them in our house. No wait until next Thursday to do it. It would be from that point. Whereas during that period, I was kind of a bit more laid back. Now, this is online, so I have to say that I complied with all the rules that I had to. We didn't have any illegal parties or anything like that. But I was kind of perhaps a little bit more relaxed on certain things and perhaps didn't take it quite as stringently as what Claire did. And that obviously stressed Claire out, and it made for a very interesting time in our house. Now, when I mention rules, perhaps for you go back to your childhood and you think about the rules that you had to adhere to as a child growing up with your parents, or perhaps you are a parent and you can think of the rules that you have had or currently do have for your children as they're growing up. If I asked my two teenage daughters, Izzy and Mia, they would probably say that Claire and I are probably on the stricter end of parenting. But we don't have huge lists of rules, really. We did kind of around bedtime and particularly around screens and bedtime, like phones not being in their bedroom after they went to bed. And that would be oh, so unfair. No one else does this. And it's I don't care. You're in my house. So, and Andy Stanley, who is a pastor in the US, whose original series, this series is based upon. And in fact, last week, we had a video from Andy Stanley's original series. He gives a great quote around kind of rules and parenting. He says this about his own experience. He said, him and his wife Sandra, did not have children so that there would be someone to keep the rules. We don't come up with a list of amazing rules and go, right, now we're ready to have some children to obey them. We do it the other way round, don't we? We have the kids and then we work out what the rules should be or not. And that's something that we're really going to think about as we go through this morning. But as I said, this week is the third and concluding part of this series. And perhaps you've not been here for the first two parts. It's quite common in the summer. I would recommend that you try and catch up those two parts online after today. You can go on forgechurch.com or our YouTube channel and catch those talks up, because each of these talks kind of build together. They link together as one, and we're going to conclude that today. But clearly, if you haven't had that chance, please don't start catching up now. I'm going to give you a very quick catch-up on what we've covered. Because the question that we've been considering through the series is clearly this heaven, who goes there? That if there's a heaven, who gets there? And how do you get there? So in week 1, we had Emily Hannah, our kids director. She came here and she spoke about that if we think only good people get to heaven, then how good is good enough? What is even good? How do you gauge good. If we consider what is good today and look back 2,000, 100 years ago, what we consider good now may not have been considered good back then, and vice versa. Even culturally today in 2024, what we consider good in our culture, in our country, may not be the same thing as what is considered good in another country or culture. So what is good? And you might expect that the place to go clearly would be the Bible, to specifically tell you how good is good enough and how do you get to heaven. Well, the problem with that is that if you read the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, well, it doesn't even mention heaven. And the second part of the Bible, which is the New Testament of Jesus' life and the early church, well, it was really made clear that no one is good, and no one is certainly good enough to earn their own way to heaven. So if good people go to heaven, and that's how we get there, then kind of God's being a bit unfair because he's kind of hiding the goalposts. And then last week we had this second part, the video from Andy Stanley and his original series. And he kind of started focusing on, well, what does good even mean? What does it look like? And he suggested that if only good people go to heaven, then actually that would mean that Jesus himself was wrong and mistaken through his life. Because Jesus said he was here for sinners. And that those that were considered good at the time, the best of the best, the kind of Pharisees, the high priests, the people who followed all the rules in the Jewish law, who considered themselves good and the best, he said to them, you're not guaranteed to get to heaven. In fact, you might be the last people to get to heaven. And he slammed them because they just didn't get it. And Jesus himself actually demonstrated that bad people could go to heaven, that it's not actually good people that get there. Jesus demonstrated through his own life and his teaching that forgiven people get to heaven. And that's kind of where we concluded last week, and that's where I'll pick up from this week. So we're going to pick up from this, from a question that kind of sits at the very center of where this perhaps confusion originates from around how good you have to be to go to heaven. The question is this: if being good won't get you into heaven, then why all the rules? Why all the rules? If being good is not about going into heaven, why all the rules? And how did it get so confused? And where did the idea even come from that if you're good enough, you'll get to heaven? And the place to start to answer this question is sometimes kind of where the confusion perhaps originates from around rule keeping and all of that. And that's these. It's the 10 Commandments. I'm sure you've heard of the 10 Commandments. These are a list of 10 commands that God gave to his people. We find them very early on in the Bible, in the second book called Exodus. It's actually very much a core text to the Jewish religion as well. And really, Exodus chronicles the story of the Israelite nation, the Jewish nation, and their exit or exodus from Egypt when they were in slavery in Egypt. Just a very, very quick context to Exodus. How did that all come about? How did they find themselves in Egypt? Whistle-stop tour here. So there's a guy called Abraham in the very first book of the Bible called Genesis, a guy called Abraham. And God calls Abraham. He made a promise to this very, very old man, a married man who had no children, that he would be the father of all nations. He didn't have any children. He was ancient. And that God would give Abraham and his wife Sarah a family so big that they wouldn't be able to count them all. And this obviously seemed pretty mad to Abraham at the time, but Abraham went along with it, and God said, these are going to be my chosen people. And Abraham went along with it, and they had some children and sons, etc., and then they had children. And then another guy turns up, Abraham's great-grandson. He's called Joseph. You'll know Joseph through Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. Joseph had a very turbulent life, let's put it that way. But he basically ends up being a big shot in Egypt. He reports directly to the Pharaoh. So he's kind of like the second most important person in the whole land of Egypt. And eventually, Joseph brings his entire family, his 11 brothers and everybody else, over to Egypt to live and settle in Egypt. That's great. They settle. They multiply like crazy. Just as God had said, you're going to be the father of all nations, they multiply like crazy. And that actually makes Pharaoh and the Egyptian people very, very nervous. They're worried that these Israelites are going to take over their country. So they think, right, we need to do something about this. So basically, the Egyptians enslaved the entire Israelite nation. They made them slaves. They were second-class citizens. The Egyptians were there, and they were the bosses, and every single Israelite was a slave. They were a slave state within this country of Egypt, and it stayed that way for 400 years. And then eventually, God moves. He kind of decides, right, I've got to do something about this. And he calls a guy who, again, you should have heard of, is Moses. And he tells Moses to go to the Pharaoh of the time and say, God says to let my people go. Let them free. Well, Pharaoh didn't want to do that. He had this free workforce. And so he doesn't agree. And then there's this series of plagues and things that happen where God is trying to, force Pharaoh to give in to let his people go. And they endure so many different things through these plagues. But basically, God kind of finally gets to a point where he's like, right. And he instructs Moses to say, right, tell each Israelite household tonight to slaughter a lamb in a festival to me, your Lord. And then take the blood of these lambs and spread it on the door frames of your houses. Because that night, the Lord was going to pass over the land, and any house without the lamb's blood around the doorpost, i.e. the Egyptian houses, would mean that the firstborn of those households would be killed. So every single Egyptian family would be impacted by this passing over of the Lord, except those Israelite families that had put the lamb's blood around the doorframe. The Israelites that night trusted God. And they did this act that particular night. And of course, there was this tragedy in Egypt for every single Egyptian household where the firstborn was killed. And Pharaoh, by that point, had had enough. And he says, get out, go. And so the Israelites find themselves exiting Egypt and then being free. God had rescued and delivered the Israelite nation, his nation. But the problem was that after being enslaved for 400 years, generation after generation after generation had known nothing different. And then suddenly they're free, with no one telling them what to do, no one overseeing them. Basically, they'd just been told what to do by the Egyptians. And now they were free. They had no civil law. They had no framework to live by. They didn't know how to function independently. There were like 1 to 2 million of these guys. This was a huge population finding themselves wandering around with no kind of instruction or framework to live by. And so God, through his love towards them, through Moses, provides them this constitution, a law, including how to live alongside each other and all the different aspects of their life, how to punish and all of that type of stuff, and how to just interact with one another. God is showing through that his love, his concern, his provision for his people he considered his own, whom he chose to rescue and deliver from Egypt. And he chose them not because they kept his law. The rules didn't exist when he rescued them. He rescued them before any rule keeping was possible. He'd chosen and rescued them before they had proven that they were good enough. Why? And this is the bottom line that we're thinking about this morning, is because of this. It's because for God, relationship always precedes the rules. God didn't give the law, the rules, to establish a relationship with him. He didn't say, if you can keep these rules, you can be part and you qualify as part of my family. He gave them the law because they were already part of the family. They were already in relationship with him. It wasn't a condition to the relationship. It was confirmation that they were in the family already. Just like a parent with their children, keeping the rules is not a condition or a qualification to be part, to enter the family. It's confirmation that you are part of it, that someone cares and wants the best for you. As I said, for God, relationship always precedes the rules. So let's come back to the 10 Commandments. So we find ourselves on Mount Sinai, And God gives the law to Moses to then pass on to the Israelites. And actually, he doesn't just start off reeling off the rules and thou shalt nots. He actually starts again with underlining his relationship with them. It says this in Exodus chapter 20, I am the Lord, your God. It's like we've got a connection here. We're in a relationship. I've already chosen you. I've rescued you from Egypt. And if you had forgotten, this is what I've done. It goes on. It says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You belong to Pharaoh, and now I've rescued you, and you belong in my family now. And in order to be part of my family, it hasn't required anything from you except one single expression of trust and faith that I asked you to do, and that was to spread the blood of the lamb around the doorpost. That's all I've asked you to do as an action to show that you trusted me. And because you've done that, because you showed your trust and faith in me, you're in the family. He's saying, now you know I have your best interests at heart. I want you to follow me. I want you to obey me. And so he begins listing these 10 commandments. And he starts off focusing the first 4, again, on relationship between him and his people. These are paraphrased, but they're basically, have no other gods before me. Don't put anything in the way. It's just me and you. It's a direct line. Secondly, don't worship any idols. Don't be distracted by anything else. You don't need an idol of me. They didn't keep that very well. A couple of chapters on, they build a golden calf and it all goes a bit wrong. But he's basically, don't worship any idols. You don't need any distractions or anything in the way. Don't misuse my name. Don't disrespect me. Oh, and by the way, take a day off. Have a Sabbath. Make it holy. And this for them was like mind-blowing. They'd been slaves. They didn't know what a weekend was. They had to work every single day, and that's how they were fed. And then all of a sudden they're saying, take a day off? Yeah, take a day off because I'm going to sustain you. You're part of my family now. This is about our relationship. And this is all about God wanting a relationship with his people. I don't have a slide for it, but the final 6 of the 10 commandments are all about how to treat other people and how to honor them. Kind of, this is how you should act. He didn't only just want a relationship with his people, he wanted his people to have a strong relationship with one another, to look out for one another, to care for one another, to treat one another well. And actually, God was teaching his people something. Actually, he was teaching this over a long period of time, and actually still today valid for us. That God was demonstrating that everyone is valuable to him. Everyone matters, and this is what the rules were for, to keep them safe. And these were just this is like the top 10. This is just a starter of an incredibly, extraordinarily detailed constitution that follows, and a law for this particular nation at that time on how to live and treat one another. There were over 600 laws that God provided. Why so many? Well, it had to touch on every single part of their life. They had known nothing different for 400 years. They didn't know how to function. Why so detailed? Because God cared for them. Because with God, again, relationship always precedes the rules. And despite some very challenging moments over the years and hundreds of years that that subsequently came, God never abandoned the people of Israel. He'd made this covenant with them through his actions and also through their single action of trust in the lamb's blood. And that covenant would just not be broken. And so that's where quite often this idea of being good enough or rule keeping, because there was all these rules that were introduced to these people, kind of originates from about why it is you have to be good to get to heaven. But let's fast forward like 1,500 years. Because 1,500 years later, Jesus is sat with his 12 disciples. And they're in Jerusalem, and it's the time of the annual Passover celebration. This celebration, remembering what God had done to them in rescuing them from Egypt 1,500 or so years before, in giving them their freedom. They remembered that every year. And they remembered it by killing a lamb and putting the blood around their doorframe. And so Jesus was there leading this very, very familiar celebration, this kind of act of remembrance with his disciples. But he does something very different at that moment. Thinking about the law and the rules, he does actually something really blasphemous. Something that actually the disciples, as good Jewish people, should have walked out the room for. They should have kind of abandoned him. Because in leading this act of remembrance at this time to God, Jesus does and says this, and we find it in Luke's gospel. He said, he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Do this in remembrance, not of God, of me. This ritual that the Jewish people have been doing for 1,500 years to remember what God had done for them, Jesus says, from now on, do this in remembrance for me and what I'm about to do. What God did 1,500 years ago for the Jewish nation, I'm about to do for the entire world. And he goes on and he says this, the verse continues, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." The old covenant was what God had done for them all those years before. This cup is a new covenant, a new relationship, a new approach. Jesus said, "This cup is my blood." And do you know what? That night, it didn't make any sense to them at all. But the next day, Jesus would shed his blood for them on the cross. For the whole world. Not just for them, not just for them, for you, for me, for the whole entire world. The old covenant done with lamb's blood on a door frame, Jesus says, you don't need to do that anymore. I'm going to be the final one. I'm the final lamb. And this was foretold. The disciples had heard this before. You see, John the Baptist had declared in front of crowds when introducing Jesus, he said this, "This is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." God was about to do a new thing through Jesus, a new covenant for the whole world. And the only condition, again, was a single expression of trust and faith, this time in acknowledging and following Jesus as their Savior. What does this mean for us? You might be sitting here thinking, that was a nice history lesson and some things around the Bible, but what does it mean for us, Mike, here? Well, ironically, I want to go back to the Bible. And to make this link, I want to go back to a guy who we talk about quite a lot, quite rightfully, is a guy called Paul. Paul wrote half of the New Testament part of the Bible, the second half of the Bible. And actually, Paul, before he'd had a transformational encounter with the risen Jesus. Paul was a Pharisee before that. A Pharisee, these were the scholars, the Jewish scholars, the high priests. These were the rule keepers, not just the rule keepers, the rule enforcers. Paul was the best of the rule enforcers. He knew everything. He made checks on who did and who didn't follow the rules and punished them for it. He actually went personally to extreme lengths to suppress this Jesus movement whilst Jesus was alive. But after this encounter, as I said, with the risen Jesus, Paul became a prolific follower of Jesus. Paul had thought he knew it all. And when he met Jesus, really, the risen Jesus, his whole worldview changed. He was the best rule follower before. And now he considered himself and called himself the chief of all sinners. He recognized it wasn't about following the rules. And Paul, being this educated, very, very educated follower, he could pick up and recognize this parallel between what God had done for the Jewish nation all those years ago and what Jesus had just done for the whole world. He also recognized that actually while he and others did anything bad, and while they were doing the things bad, before they even realized they needed forgiveness or realized they needed forgiveness at all, Jesus did something for them. Paul says, look, God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. Now, as we sit here in 2024 and we read that back, we can perhaps apply that figuratively to our lives. We can see that there may be meaning for us in our lives today, that Christ did do that for us. What you need to remember is when Paul was writing this, he was meaning it literally. He was doing all this crazy bad stuff. He was suppressing and with violence and everything the Jesus followers. And even though he did that, even if he was trying to do everything in his power to stop this Jesus movement, whilst he was sinning, Christ died for him. He means it literally. And in fact, that's valid for us today. Christ died for us before we've done anything or realized that we need it. His forgiveness, Christ died for us. He's already done it. And then 2 verses later, Paul goes on in this verse to a group of Christians called the Romans. It goes on. It says, while we were God's enemies, and he was literally God's enemies, we were reconciled to him. How were we reconciled to God? Through rule keeping? No. It was through this, through the death of his son. And the reason why Jesus is the good news for us all is that he's made it clear. He's made it clear that we can't behave our way in. We can't, if you like, not English, but good our way in. Just like with a parent, your children can't behave their way into your family. They just are. The relationship precedes the rules. And the best bit is that due to this new covenant that Jesus had provided us through his death, is this, that we can't misbehave our way out. We can't be so bad that we find ourselves outside of the family of God. And maybe some of you need to hear that today. His grace is sufficient. There is nothing we can do for God not to love us or offer his grace, mercy, and forgiveness for. We cannot bad our way out. So why all the rules? Well, God isn't trying to make bad people good. God, when he originally brought those rules, was trying to keep free people free. He didn't want them to go back to slavery. He didn't want them to be doing things they shouldn't be doing. And the same is true for us today. He cares and loves for us today. Because God, like all parents, is this. It's relationship always precedes the rules. The rules were simply God's way of saying, because I love you, this is how I want you to live. Here's how I want you to forgive each other. Here's how I want you to treat each other. Here's how I want you to serve one another. Because living like this brings peace and freedom in your life and in the lives of those around you. And Jesus actually went further, and he kind of made it very simple to say, difficult to do, but really he made it really clear and really simple. He said, actually, this is how I want you to live. Just treat other people the way I've treated you. In John 13, it says this. Jesus was speaking. He's talking to his disciples. He's saying, a new command I give you. The 10 commandments, the rules are all over there, but this is the new command I give you. It's as simple as this. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. You know, perhaps you're, in closing, perhaps you're sitting here today. Perhaps you've not been to church before. Or perhaps you're really new to all this stuff. And if that's you, we are so pleased you're here. We are so pleased you're here. You may not consider yourself a Christian. Perhaps you're thinking, Mike, you don't know what I've done, the way I've lived my life in the past. I haven't followed the rules, didn't even know the rules, and I'm not a good person. I want you to hear these 3 words. It doesn't matter. Remember, with God, relationship precedes the rules. Here at the Forge, we want you to feel welcome and that you belong regardless of what you believe. But do know that we also want you to know that Jesus gave his life for you. And it's about Simply acknowledging that and accepting his gift of forgiveness for you. Perhaps you are a Christian. Perhaps you are a follower of Jesus and you've been part of churches all your life or for significant portions of your life. Well, perhaps you needed this reminder. Sometimes we can get so obsessed with the rules, even rules we've made up ourselves in churches, etc. We can get obsessed with them and we think it's all about following the rules and that's how you get to heaven. And we can end up in that situation judging other people that don't follow our rules. And perhaps sometimes we don't follow those rules ourselves either, yet we judge others for not. And if you have been judged in that way, I really want to apologize to you for that. Because that's not a good situation for us or the others looking at us. Or perhaps you have thought it's about following the rules and that's what it's really about, and then you haven't quite followed them, and all you are racked with is guilt. You don't need to feel any of that. It doesn't disqualify you. God's forgiveness and grace is more than sufficient to cover anything that you've done or not done. Because for us all, the invitation to be part of God's family is a permanently open, recurring invitation that never, ever expires. An invite that is not accepted through promises to do better next time. It's not accepted on how well you've kept the rules. It is accepted, that invitation, by acknowledging what what Jesus has already done for you. You know, John, one of Jesus' closest disciples, summarized this for us, that God sent his son into the world not to judge the world on how well you've kept the rules. He's not doing that. God sent his son into the world to save the world through Jesus. It's not about following the rules or being perfect. As we conclude this series, who goes to heaven? Forgiven people go to heaven. How are you forgiven? Through Jesus Christ, our Savior. Full stop. Should we stand? I'm going to pray, and the band are going to lead us in a last song. Father, there will be people here, and I include myself, that think that we can kind of earn our way to heaven, earn our way to your love. That we have to keep all the rules, and if we don't keep the rules, and we just feel guilt and we feel further away from you. And we forget that it's not anything about that. It's about what you've done for us already, that we are your chosen people, that you, more than anything, want us to be in relationship with you. And you gave your son, Jesus, to die on a cross. And you didn't leave him dead. And he rose from the grave so that we have this direct connection with you, that all of the sin and the shame can be covered by this new covenant, this cup of your blood given for us. And if there's people here this morning, Lord, that are hearing this for the first time and it's resonating in some way, Lord, I just pray that those people have the courage to act on that, to speak to someone, to pray about that, to contact someone that they know. And for us, for people that may kind of know this already, to act as a reminder, to not judge others, to love others. Would you help us with that, Lord? Amen.